Oh boy, do I have a surprise for you guys today. And it's something I'm sure not many of you have expected. I think the Fullbring Arc of Bleach is the best arc I've read in this series. And that genuinely surprised me, because going into this Bleach series, it wasn't long before I heard whispers of a certain arc, an arc that was held in either medium or low regard amidst the vast majority of its own community. I've only seen a few praise it, with others saying it's okay, all the while I've seen many call it a very questionable creative choice. Needless to say, there seems to be a tremendous amount of division concerning this arc, and I hope to put an end to that today. Okay, well, maybe not. In what I've just realized isn't even so much a review as it is an analysis or love letter to what has become easily my favorite arc in this series. I'm totally not Tsukushima, and this is my love letter to Kubo's incredible Fullbring Arc. Now, I can already hear the tapping of confused and angry fingers on keyboards. Please save your energy and do not fret. It's possible you had an entirely different experience with the material to me, and right now it's my job to explain exactly why I think this arc is not only worthy of your time and reconsideration, but also, most importantly, why I think it's better than every other arc that I've come across in this series, including the Soul Society. Now, I like this arc so much I read it twice. Yeah, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, twice. So how is this possible? I'm a reasonable person. I spend a lot of time reviewing manga. How did I come away with this point of view? Well, put quite simply, this arc does everything I loved about the other arcs really well, while not being dragged down by the criticisms I had for those very arcs specifically. In other words, I think this arc enjoys all of the upsides with very few, if any, of the downsides from the prior arcs. Last time we touched base with Ichigo, we noticed he had lost his powers and, in a somewhat somber and nostalgic fashion, parted ways with Rukia, with her having now left both his view and his perception seemingly forever. This was a surprisingly bittersweet and oddly fitting way to conclude not just this arc, but perhaps the whole series, I thought, making it one of the better moments in the entire Arrancar arc for me, which made me all the more curious as to how the Fullbring arc would make use of this very unique situation. One of the arguments I've heard as to why this arc isn't as enjoyable is due to how it feels so much more insignificant in scope and scale compared to past outings, and how, in essence, it feels very much like a reset. Now, I don't think I can argue against either of these points entirely, though what I would personally argue is that these so-called negatives I see as actual positives. Furthermore, I'd say calling this arc a reset isn't entirely fair or accurate either. In fact, I'd probably argue that Fullbring has the most interesting continuation from one end of an arc to the beginning of a new one. Following the events that colored the climax of the Arrancar arc, instead of picking up immediately following that very climax, we instead are forced to contend with a host of new and refreshing problems for Ichigo to deal with. Problems I would argue offer a look into his character the other arcs either didn't hit as sharply or didn't contend with at all. Following the events of the very first arc, Substitute Shinigami, and the second arc, Soul Society, Ichigo's path is crystal clear. Whether the road ahead may or may not be difficult, Ichigo has a clear goal to shoot for with the correct stressors in place to give him the convictions necessary to achieve his goals. Rescue Rukia, rescue Orihime. This arc, however, is importantly different. Instead of possessing a goal immediately following the Arrancar arc, Ichigo actually makes a commendable sacrifice, with the story ending on a unique note. One of sacrifice and parting ways with a dear friend seemingly for good. And 17 months pass by and he doesn't have a goal any longer. His life has returned to normal, in fact more normal than it otherwise has ever been now that he's no longer pestered by his one-time emerging power set. For the very first time in his life, he's a normal person whose only expectation now is to take care of the normal commitments that one would have as a 17-year-old boy growing up in Japan. Those commitments being keeping up with his friends, striving to do well in school, diligently attend his extracurricular activities, and of course, his new part-time job. However, the Ichigo we once knew isn't exactly there. Where many series opt to use the time skip in their stories to highlight the progression of time and the evolution or growth of a given character, a la Dragon Ball, One Piece, and Naruto, Kubo decided to use this time skip to highlight the lack of growth or de-evolution of Ichigo Kurosaki in Bleach's Fullbring Arc. As his grades slip, he feels more distant with his friends and loses interest in out-of-school activities and commitments. Where everyone else seems to be doing well and preparing for the next stages of their lives, Ichigo seems to have his mind squarely on what was. Now a protector with no means of protecting anyone, requiring at times for those he cares about to now pick up the slack that he no longer can carry. With this very inability to let go of the past leading to these strange dreams where he hears Rukia's voice. It's a very compelling and sad way to kick this arc off, particularly after a time skip. And following an arc with a length greater than the Saiyan, Frieza, and Cell sagas combined, with a bloated and crippling dedication to showing every fight, no matter how important it may or may not be to the story, having recycled a motivation from a previous arc, for the Fullbring Arc to chronicle a story less than 1/4 the length, all the while focusing on Ichigo's internal struggle and the mistakes that stemmed from that, I found that very creative choice and execution utterly fascinating, with it providing an introduction that offered plenty in the way of possibility without any of the cliche that plagued Soul Society and eventually the Arrancar arc. And that's not even to draw attention to how they brilliantly developed this story into the second and third acts, for it's through this despair and sense of longing for what was that leads Ichigo down the path which ultimately defines this arc.
Ramen Kuka.
Ginjo is an interesting character throughout this arc from beginning to end, and he achieves this by being a character that constantly evolves in ways that consistently add interest to the various parts of the story that he participates within, making him, in my estimation, the real MVP of this arc. With his second interaction within the first act of this story, between himself and Ichigo acting as effectively his very own call to action for Ichigo. Ichigo thinks he knows who Urahara is? He thinks he knows his family? Well, think again. And perhaps most importantly, he offers Ichigo the chance to get back everything he's longed for these past 17 months. His powers. Following this interaction and segueing into the second act of the story, this is where Fullbring once again, I think, does something better than the other sections of the story have. Where the Arrancar arc and the Soul Society arc devolve for a time into a little too much fighting, and in the case of the former, way too much fighting, the Fullbring arc instead has training with a heavy emphasis on character interaction. One of the greatest strengths of the Fullbring arc, I think, is that it makes use of the fact other arcs have already introduced a ton of characters by only feeling the need to introduce a few new ones in this runtime. And due to the main cast of this arc being centered around just a few characters already familiar to us through Ichigo, we get to explore how each of these characters, Grindo's allies and friends, all behave and treat each other, facilitating not only this segment of the story, but also achieving the necessary build-up for these personalities when they ultimately become used in the significantly more action-focused conclusion. And okay, that's another thing. This arc, while the first 75% has some fighting, it's by no means the focus, and honestly, that's the arc's strongest aspect. It's almost as if Kubo said to himself, you know what, I went a little overboard with the fighting in the Arrancar arc. It's time to write an emotional, character-driven mystery thriller. And boy, does he achieve just that. It's my favorite aspect of this story, and I'll definitely be talking about it in just a moment, but before I do, let's discuss the core focus of the arc and what is effectively the mechanical driving force and namesake of the arc itself. Let's discuss the Fullbring mechanic. The Fullbring mechanic is one which has been alluded to in Chad's ability prior, and while not being the focus of the arc itself despite its namesake, it is an integral part of the arc itself, without which none of this would be possible. And thank God it is possible, because the ability's unpredictable and amorphous nature in how it manifests in its users is exactly what allows this arc the flexibility and freedom to deliver the most memorable moments I've experienced from this series. The second act of the story starts off with an obvious call to action, as I mentioned, from Ginjo. However, it's initially one Ichigo doesn't trust or is uncertain as to whether or not he should explore. That is until the secondary plot and arguably the most interesting narrative aspect of this story is introduced, as Uryu is pursuing someone suspicious. Once back at the hospital and in the correct care, Uryu's father informs Orihime that Uryu wasn't attacked by either a Hollow or a Soul Reaper, with his hypothesis being that the next target might be someone similar to Uryu, perhaps Chad or herself, Orihime. Reminded once again of what he needs to protect, Ichigo throws caution to the wind and makes contact with Ginjo. And this is where he learns how to use his Fullbring power, and it's where that clip of him with that questionably large emblem comes from also. This section of the arc is essentially about Ichigo trying to regain the agency he's since lost, both literally and narratively. The training itself takes him to interesting situations, from being shrunk down into a dollhouse, fighting a Yakuza's soul in the body of a stuffed animal, all the way to fighting Ginjo himself inside a video game.
Okay, wow, you're throwing a lot at me here.
With Ichigo coming to learn that the very deputy badge he's been carrying around is the key to his Fullbring ability, and by extension, the restoration of his abilities, symbolizing a time where he had friendships he's missed and powers he could use to protect them with. However, curiously, once again, following his training, he hears Rukia's voice following it, forcing us to contend with the possibility that that dream where he thought he could hear her was in fact linked to his badge in some way. The best part. Okay, it's time to talk about the best part of this arc, and by far the part that gave me the most joy. As I mentioned, there are a lot of ideas that compound to make this arc feel special. However, around 60 to 75% of the way through the arc itself, following the training reprieve, the story itself does something amazing by shifting and transforming from what we've come to know and expect from Bleach into this horrific psychological thriller type narrative. Seriously, it's unlike anything I've seen from this series, and maybe also unlike anything I've seen or come across in both One Piece, Naruto, Dragon Ball, or whatever. It's such a unique idea, and it's explored in such a captivating fashion. I've always said that Bleach, first and foremost, has felt like a very character-driven story, with it producing less interesting material when it takes the focus off of the characters themselves. And so, with Fullbring's introduction of this tonal shift, it takes what otherwise felt like a refreshing slice-of-life reprieve from the world-ending stakes of the prior arc into a set of circumstances that genuinely felt more high stakes than when Aizen was front and center for me. And that's not because I don't know the difference in scale between the world at stake and Ichigo's life being at stake, but because Ichigo is our means of seeing through into this world. It's like our very existence in this plane that we've now invested almost 500 chapters into is being stolen from us as readers right before our eyes. Like, fuck you, Tsukushima, you didn't save Rukia, you didn't save Orihime or defeat Aizen. We did, I mean Ichigo did. And while I think Ginjo is the MVP of this arc, I think Tsukishima is the other half of that coin, which grants this arc a level of dread and excitement that for me has been unmatched in this series. One by one, we see him pick off Ichigo's comrades, with his brush with Orihime being particularly curious, as this is where we first start to get a taste of what his power truly is, with her not only appearing perfectly fine physically after what appeared to be a stabbing through her heart, but that she also suddenly thought of him, Tsukushima, as a friend. And as the time ticks on by and conflicts fly past, slowly but surely, one after another, Ichigo's former allies suddenly appear to change, not physically, but psychologically, with the very fact that these words are coming from his friends making it all the more unsettling. Showing up in his home, his place of work, and on the street, Tsukishima is less of an imposing force of nature and more so a ghostly specter or spirit that follows Ichigo until he's exhausted every support system he possesses, creating a scenario of not just dread, not just fear, but one of genuine confusion and hopelessness. For we, much like Ichigo in this instance, have no clue as to the parameters of this power Tsukishima possesses. He's brainwashed everyone into thinking that Ichigo is in the wrong here. We have no idea if killing him will result in the desired outcome we want, or if killing him will seal his friends' fates as they currently are. Brainwashed into believing that Tsukishima is their best friend and almost like family. And furthermore, these circumstances only push Ichigo, and by extension us, into the arms of Ginjo, who is, at this point in the story, the only one left who can possibly help us, making that acceptance all the easier for us as readers, and that's important narratively. It's this fascinating philosophical and emotional situation that made for a climax that, hand on my heart, was more exciting and had me on the edge of my seat from the beginning to end than not practically, every other arc in this series. There were so many twists, turns, and hopeful moments in the final section that I can safely say that I have never been more invested by a storyline in Bleach. However, I will caveat what I'm saying for just a moment here. For many of you out there that do not share my opinion, I cannot of course speak to your experience. Perhaps if I had been reading this week to week, I might be singing a different tune and this might not have been as effective on me. Or perhaps had I watched this unfold in the anime, I might not have enjoyed it as much. However, as an arc that I can sit down for an afternoon and consume in a binge, it's easily been the most enjoyable sequence of the series for me. By a country mile too, it's not even close. Despite being right now situated a decent ways into the climax, I was still unaware as to how this could possibly be resolved. And just as I had this feeling, Ginjo, Ichigo's last ally, gets stabbed by Tsukishima. Oh my god! Tsukishima's speech is legitimately chilling to listen to, talking about how he, Ichigo, is the only one who has the memories he does now, how he is the one who's living the false past, all the while forcing us to watch on as Orihime and Chad step in to defend Tsukishima. It was one of the most unsettling things to me, which also repackages their own desire, Orihime and Chad's desire to get better, to get stronger while Ichigo is out of action, turning that aspect of their characters against Ichigo, also reinforcing the theme of this arc, which is to get back into the action for Ichigo. In the previous arc, I was so jaded from fighting, seemingly for fighting's sake, whereas now, with all of the interpersonal relationships and histories hanging in the balance, I've never had my attention held so perfectly. It's so good. And then this happens.
Oh man. Oh god. Oh man.
All of this time, he was in cahoots with Tsukishima. Having told him to stab him to make it so that they were enemies to avoid suspicion, Tsukishima's power and Ginjo's convictions are precisely what made this plan so convincing and possible. It's brilliantly unfolded. It feels so much less conventional and so much darker. I mentioned earlier that Ginjo is the MVP of this arc, and honestly, I stand by that. In Act 1, he injects a fascinating sense of mystery to the plot, a sense of unease, as well as offering Ichigo the chance to regain his powers. In the second act, he provides Ichigo with a mentorship he needs in this tough situation, and as the circumstances worsen and worsen, he acts almost like a big brother to him, with Act 3 showcasing who he really is. This arc's inverse of Ichigo. Someone who was once on the same path Ichigo was on, but was left out in the cold. Couldn't form trusting relationships with people, which ultimately leads to his demise. And I think this next point really speaks to the character writing of this arc, but each and every act of this story simply wouldn't work without him. He facilitates so much of what makes this arc interesting and possible, and from the very beginning he's deceitful, but we let it go due to how the arc manages our attention. And as the beat plot develops, we become more and more in need of allies for Ichigo to latch onto as the world comes crumbling down around him, thanks to Tsukishima's mind manipulation ability. And once the perfect moment reveals itself for Ginjo to get his mask off moment, it is there for us to relish in. It's perfectly placed. Whether or not I saw it coming is sort of irrelevant. I had my suspicions but wasn't convinced. But what I appreciated was how it makes sense and how perfectly timed the execution of this reveal was. The arc itself is wonderfully focused and knows exactly what it wants to be, delivering this interesting contrast not only between Ichigo and Ginjo, but Ichigo and his former self. I didn't mention this at the beginning of the video, but the beginning of this arc shows a very clear contrast between the present now in this arc and the very first chapter of this series. But what's more is that I noticed in this arc, more than any other I've read, it comes across as a contrast and callback to the first arc as a whole and highlights how each and every central character has grown. Ichigo, a character that was once learning how to adopt responsibility, now yearns for it, is searching for it. He wants to protect his friends. Orihime and Chad, who are characters that were left out in the cold, left entirely in the dark for so much of that first arc, are instead the ones now leaving Ichigo in the dark, trying to save him from trouble, having developed their own unique skill sets for the sake of contributing to Ichigo's efforts. And Uryu, someone who once wanted nothing more than to defeat, humiliate, and remove Ichigo from the picture, specifically puts himself into tremendous danger for the sake of helping Ichigo in his hour of need. And following this utter low point, with Uryu shaking looking at Ginjo, with Orihime and Chad compromised, with Ichigo feeling utterly alone and betrayed, that's when quite literally my favorite moment in this series occurs. Now, to be clear, this hasn't been a series that's particularly tugged on my heartstrings too much. There's been fleeting moments with Orihime's goodbye during the Arrancar arc that hit the spot, but truthfully, I've not come close to being too emotional. But, and I mean this, the feeling of despair Kubo managed to craft in this moment, that high emotional stake, with the rewriting of history and compromising everyone we love, when Ichigo turns around to discover Rukia standing there as if like a guardian angel, someone finally who can offer genuine help. It reminded me of that scene from Endgame, funnily enough, where everyone comes through the portal at the end to make the save on Captain America. Seeing all of the captains we befriended come to the rescue, offering their power to Ichigo to win the day, is magnificently cathartic, particularly because we're doing it all for the reasons Ginjo and Tsukushima are trying to overwrite. Because he, Ichigo, has genuinely made an impact not only in this world, not only in his friend's world, as Orihime's love for him is evident even through her brainwashing, but also in the world of the Soul Society, making this very scene, on top of all of that, narratively and emotionally earned in my book.
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
No longer outnumbered, each captain takes a battle that suits their own character, and due to us having spent a significant amount of time with the other characters, we can actually enjoy those fights now too. Not just because we know them, mind you, but because this arc hasn't shoved fighting down my neck over and over, and because of that, this section feels a little more novel as a result. Furthermore, an example of something I really appreciated in this story was how Kubo didn't spend 2 or 3 chapters on each individual fight before showing a flashback to end it all. Instead, this arc dedicates a single chapter, chapter 471, to the flashbacks of all of these allies of Ginjo together. And the delivery of this information in this way serves these characters tremendously well as this sort of shared group of trauma that acts as the binding which unites them all. It saves time and keeps the pacing snappy, with each POV given a unique background to help differentiate them from each other within the chapter itself. Byakuya's fight with Tsukushima in the end was again another affair that forced an aspect of Byakuya outside of his comfort zone, creating a situation where he couldn't rely on his ability to diligently and dutifully prepare, but one where he had to embrace the madness of the moment, enjoying something more akin to what Kenpachi might enjoy, funnily enough, forcing Tsukushima to challenge him head on, something Byakuya points out Tsukushima isn't comfortable with. So I think this might be the first time I'm reading a conclusion to a Bleach arc where pretty much all of the antagonists hit their mark for me. Well, okay, except for that one guy who likes time. We didn't really get to know him. But that's okay, because Kubo recognizes that too and had Kenpachi one-hit KO him in the beginning, which was just hilarious. If this was the Arrancar arc, it would have taken another 5 chapters. But I digress. With the Fullbring Arc itself culminating on a single decision Ichigo needs to make, and it's a decision based on trust. Ginjo tries to convince him of the lies the Soul Society have laden him with, and paints a very dark picture that contrasts what he thought his relationship was. However, and I think fittingly, Ichigo, irrespective of this information, reveals he has suspected it prior, and that he still trusts them. Because of course he would. They came in his hour of need. They let him settle this on his own terms, and as we observed ourselves, Ginjo and Tsukushima aren't exactly above deception either. In the end, the likes of Ginjo are defeated, Tsukushima too, Orihime and Chad are restored back to normal, and the smokescreen that is the deputy badge is finally cleared. And I can honestly say that this, more than any other arc, has delivered for me the most brilliant Bleach experience to date. I think ultimately, I really ended up connecting with this arc due to the specific context I read it in. That context being my utter exhaustion and exasperation following the onslaught of fights that was the Arrancar arc. Unlike the Arrancar arc, and to a degree even the Soul Society arc, Fullbring feels like a fresh, well-executed, smaller scoped, but necessary restart. It contends with the obvious consequences and fallout of the last dramatic conclusion, and does so in a really different way. Where the Arrancar arc was wall-to-wall combat, Tsukushima is specifically non-confrontational. Where Soul Society offered conviction for Ichigo to embrace, Fullbring took an entirely different direction. One that made the entire arc far less formulaic and conventional compared compared to Soul Society. Where Substitute Shinigami didn't dedicate all of its time to telling one story, Fullbring manages to utilize all of the secondary cast, retaining that same small town feel that the first arc enjoyed, all the while delivering a story that was entirely unique and solid from beginning to end. It's not too long, it's not too short, it has some of the best character writing in the series, all the while contending with the storyline that's more in keeping with a thriller than a battle manga. All of which only works due to our knowledge of the existing characters. It possesses for me all the interpersonal charm of the first arc and all the appeal of the Soul Society arc without any of the predictability which I thought dated that arc and weighed it down a lot, particularly in its second half. And unlike the Arrancar arc and the Soul Society material, I thought for the first time in the series, the secondary supporting cast ended up contributing to this arc in such a compelling and meaningful fashion. For without the likes of Uryu and Rukia coming to their friends' aid to turn the tides and make brilliant reveals, or Chad and Orihime helping Ichigo train and eventually facilitate my favorite portion of the story through their zombification, this story simply wouldn't have worked even in the slightest. Fullbring is my antidote to how the Arrancar arc made me feel, and my guess is that the anime, much like how I've noticed it did with other arcs, it may have done the same with the Fullbring, that being either change the arc or inject so much filler that it ruins the arc. And for that reason, I cannot stress how wonderful and easy a read it is in the manga. At just 58 chapters in length, it has something for everyone, I think. It is for these reasons and many more that I can safely say that the Fullbring arc of Bleach gets the totally not mark thumbs up of approval, and so far it's the best arc I've read in Bleach comfortably. It takes far more risks and assumes a much less conventional structure than I felt the Soul Society arc did. It delivers a much more focused story than Substitute Shinigami, and it is exactly as long as it needs to be, unlike the Arrancar arc. To me, it's easily the best arc Kubo has penned, and it's not even close.